Hello and welcome to Telecom TV. We are here at the SDN NFV World Congress in The Hague in the Netherlands, and I'm talking with Mansoor Hanif, CTO of Ofcom. Mansoor, great to see you again. It's been a while. Thanks for talking to us.
You're welcome.
Let's begin with this. How do we see the next few years shaping up? From your point of view, from a regulator's point of view, do you think we're looking down the line at a hybrid legacy NFV cloud native network, firstly, and do you think the industry will be able to manage it?
Yeah, I think there are very interesting times now. I think if you look at it from what we see happening in the service provider world, in the operator world, I think what you just mentioned, a hybrid transition towards virtualization, potentially some cloud native, potentially more traditional NFV, but also managing the legacy is very likely. So from their perspective. At the same time, I think there's interest from a range of new players in telecoms that we are also keen to make sure that they have the opportunity to develop networks based on new technology, especially in the UK where there are some underserved areas of the market. So we're keen that there's space for them as well, and I think some of the new players might actually have a much more forward-looking architecture which is already cloud native from the beginning. So I think it's going to be an interesting dichotomy.
How do you see, from a regulator's point of view, the effects that the transformation of the network is having on the industry overall?
Yeah, I think from the regulator's point of view, what we're really focused on is the end result for consumers and citizens. So we're very aware of the advantages that virtualization can bring, and the whole of the transformation of service providers into the digital world we think potentially has massive benefits for consumers, so we're very supportive. At the same time, we need to make sure that that transition is managed in the right way. We need to protect consumers from the potential issues that could happen if it's badly managed. So we're making sure that we are discussing with whoever is moving very, very quickly into the virtualized space to make sure that the quality of service and the customer experience is protected during that transition, whether it's normal consumers or also potentially vulnerable consumers as they move in that transition. That's a key role that we play. So I think on that side we are very much engaged, but we're also keen to make sure that the security and resiliency of these networks is first and foremost, and we are also engaged with the industry to make sure that whatever they do in this space, security is built in up front so that people can actually rely on these networks, especially as these networks go more into more sensitive areas of the industry and of the economy. In the UK, for example, expanding into areas such as manufacturing, utilities, etc., means that we need to be vigilant that this is done in a way that actually increases the trust in those networks.
Thank you. Again, with your regulators hat on, obviously, there's been a lot of focus in recent months on NFVI and drastically reducing the number of competing architectures through the CNTT, the Common NFVI Telco Task Force. How important do you think initiatives like this are from your standpoint?
Yeah, I think the NFVI space is a very good place to start in terms of moving things forward to a common platform, at least for the hardware. I think there are some choices about where collaboration can be most effective, and from our perspective, where it's going to be most in the interests of consumers and citizens and businesses. So there's a number of areas that are perhaps more problematic. I think things like overall orchestration and automation need to be managed very, very carefully because of the potential risks. So that's where people might be more wary of coming to common platforms. I think in terms of the underlying hardware for NFV, as illustrated by the NFVI space, where we saw here at this conference yesterday a multiplayer conference yesterday focused on the CNTT new initiative. I think that's a great place to start, because I think that's an area where even if people get together and agree on a small range of common architectures, there's still going to be a huge amount of choice for consumers and users, so competition in that sense will still be very active and very dynamic. So that type of collaboration means that technologies can move forward, they can scale up, they can address areas of the market that are completely underserved. For example, in the UK, indoor coverage for multi-operator, or business coverage for SMEs, where today we still have a lack of deployments. This is a space where operators can actually find a model that can actually extend that coverage further while still providing a competitive market for services to end customers. So my feeling is it's the right place to start. I would focus on the indoor market and the SME market, and we would certainly encourage operators to work together on a common hardware platform. We are always careful in terms of competition that the collaboration doesn't get in the way in terms of actually limiting consumer choices rather than widening them, which is what we all want.
Thank you. Do you think we're really at the point where CSPs at last realise there's no point in competing at the lower network layers, and it makes sense to collaborate here instead of competing on services? Now, you covered part of that in the answer to the previous question, but how important, again from a regulatory point of view, do you think that could be?
Well, I wouldn't like to put words in the mouths of the CSPs, but from what we're seeing, I think the fact that there has been this workshop here at this conference, the SDN NFV World Congress, shows that is becoming effectively accepted by most operators around the world and their vendors. So I think there is an understanding that there are areas where competing providers can share and collaborate more while keeping the competition very much alive. So yes, I agree that I think they've understood that the hardware level is an area that they can actually have common benefits of a common platform. We're also seeing in the UK initiatives such as the shared rule network, which has come from the operator spontaneously. Yep. Interestingly, in those areas, we are actively engaged with the government to see can that give benefits to consumers in the rural areas. There has been less focus on the actual potential of virtualization and virtualized platforms such as NFVI to actually extend the coverage in the rural areas. I think that's something that's coming up perhaps in the next year or two. But initially, I think, as I said, indoor and small business in particular is an area where operators have understood they can collaborate more to make sure that the cost model is lowered, but they can still compete on the service level.
Mansoor Hanif, you were on a panel earlier on today at the SDN NFV World Congress. Well, actually I didn't see, but one of my colleagues did see because I was in here doing this. But I know you were talking about security, and some recent evidence has come out about not necessarily the state of security, but the perception of security in the transformed network. Can you tell us about what you said and why?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the why because it may not be very well known, but in Ofcom, especially in the technology area, which I lead, pretty much half of my team is engaged on security and resilience, and we're actually doing much more in that area, whether it's the NIS directive across Europe that's been applied also in the UK for internet exchange points and domain name registries, but also ensuring the security and resiliency of the UK networks, fixed and mobile. So we're very actively engaged on this. We have participated with the government on parts of the supply chain review that they've recently done. We are also working with them and the NCSC on the definition of the new security requirements. Mm-hmm. So what you mentioned about what came out last week was an EU-wide high-level risk analysis of 5G networks and future technological networks and the supply chains around them. And I think it was a very preliminary report that was done partially with the national agencies, looking at how they're approaching it in each country, but also the EU Commission and the ENISA, which looks after cybersecurity for the EU. Yeah. So they've pointed out a number of concerns, and they plan to produce a toolbox of methods to manage those risks and those concerns by the end of the year, and we'll be contributing through the UK agencies into that. If you kind of step back a little bit and look at the concerns they're raising, there are three broad types. One is virtualization, so softwarization of technologies. The other one is open source. They're concerned about how open source software will be managed, how it will be updated, how the upgrades will be done, how the fragmented supply chain can increase security and lower risk rather than the opposite. And obviously there's a concern about 5G, which is more related to the massive potential of 5G in spreading into areas that are currently not integrated into a single framework. So coming from a technical background myself, I think that all of those areas have got solutions, but they are perhaps not structured in a way that can actually give the confidence to the security agencies and the governments around the EU and around the world that there is a way forward that can be properly managed. So that'll be part of the toolbox. I think the industry here needs to do more. On the other hand, the other thing that was highlighted in the high-level report was the current restricted supply chain that we have in telecoms is not good for anybody. So whatever your concerns are, whether it's reliability, whether it's other national security concerns, having a very small number of suppliers is only going to increase your risk. So at the same time, we need to do more to allow a wider range of suppliers to come into the chain. Potentially virtualization can massively increase that. At the same time, it can increase the risks if it's not managed well. So there's a balance to be had there. And we're keen to build on incrementally on the work that's already been done through the 5G trials in the UK that were funded by DCMS to actually bring together a wider ecosystem, look at how we can actually structure things so that you can at the same time have a secure framework for more players to get into, but at the same time make sure that framework isn't so heavy-handed that it will only limit the new players who can come into the space and leave us in a space where our universe is expanding but the number of suppliers is restricting.
I find it fascinating and interesting that something like open source and virtualization, we could leave 5G to one side for a while, has now the perception of it, considering how long it's been going on, has suddenly come to this conclusion that there are a lot of issues that need to be sorted out. Again, we were talking about this earlier. Does this mean collaboration? Does this mean more regulation? Does it mean new laws? How is it going to be managed?
So I think that's a really good question. I think that it's already quite clear that there needs to be a strengthening of the legislation. Each country is looking at that in its own space, in its own way, depending on the current baseline. So in the UK, DCMS, together with the NCSC, have issued the supply chain review report in which they state that there are things we can do under the current legislation, we can do more of, and a lot of that will depend on, Ofcom also current powers that we're already engaging with the industry on now. But there are areas where they would like to strengthen the legislation. That might take a year or two, but certainly they're looking to legislate more. And I think the main area is extending the current powers into the supply chain, because today our powers are mainly focused on the service providers. So it's very clear the supply chain is an integral part of that. So that'll be, I think, in the direction of travel. So I think in terms of cooperation, we've seen on the EU level, I think a fairly balanced cooperation model where they're saying, look, each country should do its own baseline risk analysis. We recognize that everybody's coming from a different starting point and have a different physical structure of their networks. We should take the best practice into a common approach, look where the commonalities are, but then issue a toolbox for everybody, but not impose on each country a common solution, which will be very difficult to impose. I think it's a very balanced approach, and I think we'll see more of that. In terms of standards, I think standards will need to be modified slightly in some areas, moving away from the interfaces more to the functions, especially when the functions are virtualized. I think we can learn a lot from the open source world in terms of having rapid releases rather than having long-term plans, but a lot of that is already happening as well. But I think there's also a question about beyond the standard, the actual deployment, the configuration, the operations of networks, where today we don't really have a single framework. And I think that's where the focus of these new security requirements will be, to make sure that the whole end-to-end chain of how a network is designed, standardized, but also deployed and operated is done in a way that increases the trust in that network.
Very, very interesting, as usual. Mansoor Hanif, thanks very much.
My pleasure.